In 1941, the United States Army Air Forces sat down and wrote an official report concluding that Black Americans were mentally and psychologically incapable of flying combat aircraft. That report was not written by fringe racists on the margins of American society. It was written by senior military officers, filed through official channels, and used as the justification for keeping Black Americans out of military aviation entirely. Congress nearly voted to defund the entire training program before a single Black pilot had ever sat in a cockpit. Senior commanders filed reports predicting the experiment would fail. The institutional weight of the entire United States military was pointed in one direction, toward making sure these men never got off the ground. My name is Eddie Arsenal, and today we are talking about the Tuskegee Airmen, the 332nd Fighter Group, the men who took every single one of those predictions, every report, every insult, every institutional barrier, and turned them into aviation history that left the entire U.S. Army Air Forces speechless. And I want to be very clear about something before we go any further. This is not just a story about overcoming racism, as important as that story is. This is a story about combat effectiveness, about mission discipline, about a fighter group that compiled a combat record that any unit in any air force in the world would be proud of. These men were not just symbols, they were some of the finest combat aviators of the entire war. And the full story of what they actually did in the skies over Europe deserves to be told with the detail and the respect it has earned. Let's start at the very beginning, because the story of how the Tuskegee Airmen came to exist is almost as remarkable as what they did once they got there. In 1940, as war clouds gathered over Europe and America began the painful process of preparing for a conflict it hoped to avoid, the U.S. military was conducting its mobilization under a framework of complete racial segregation. Black Americans served in the military. They had served in every American war since the Revolution, but always in segregated units, almost always in support roles, and almost never in positions that required what the military called leadership ability or technical skill. The Army Air Corps, the predecessor to the Army Air Forces, had never trained a single Black pilot for combat. The official position was that aviation was too technically complex, too demanding, and too dependent on quick judgment for Black Americans to master. This position was not based on any evidence. It was based entirely on the racial prejudice of the era, the same prejudice that had constructed an entire society around the idea that Black Americans were inherently inferior in intelligence, capability, and judgment. But in 1940, political pressure from Black civil rights organizations, Black newspapers, and Black members of Congress forced the Roosevelt administration to act. If Black Americans were going to be drafted into the military in large numbers, some path to combat aviation had to exist. The compromise, and it was a grudging, hostile compromise designed by people who expected and hoped it would fail, was the creation of a segregated training program at Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama. Tuskegee, Alabama, in the heart of the Jim Crow South, where the men training to fight for their country could not eat at the same lunch counter, drink from the same water fountain, or use the same bathroom as the white civilians and officers who surrounded them. Think about what that means for a moment. These men were being asked to risk their lives for a country that would not allow them to sit at the same table as the people sending them to war. That is the context in which the Tuskegee Airmen trained, and it should never be forgotten. The training program at Tuskegee was designed to be the finest military aviation training in the world, because the men running it and the men going through it understood that anything less than perfection would be used as evidence that the entire program should be shut down. The chief flight instructor was a civilian pilot named Charles Alfred Anderson, known as Chief Anderson, who had already become the first Black American to complete a transcontinental flight in 1933. He was one of the finest flight instructors in the country, and he trained his students accordingly. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt visited Tuskegee in 1941 and insisted on flying with Chief Anderson over the explicit objections of her Secret Service detail. She climbed into the plane, flew with Anderson, and then used the visit to publicly advocate for the program. One flight changed political momentum. The men who went through Tuskegee training faced a curriculum that was in many ways harder than standard military aviation training, because the washout standards were applied with particular rigidity by commanders who were looking for any excuse to end the program. Despite this, The Tuskegee program produced pilot after pilot of exceptional quality. The men who made it through were not just good enough, they were extraordinary. Because the bar had been set deliberately high, and they had cleared it anyway. The first class of Tuskegee-trained pilots graduated in March 1942. 5 pilots received their wings. 5 men who had been told by their country's military establishment that they were incapable of what they had just proven they could do. Those 5 pilots were the beginning of what would become the 99th Fighter Squadron, and later the broader 332nd Fighter Group, which would eventually include over 900 pilots and nearly 15,000 support personnel who kept those pilots in the air. Now let's talk about the aircraft, because the Tuskegee Airmen flew some of the finest aircraft of the war, and understanding the machines they flew helps you understand the missions they flew them on. The unit flew several aircraft types during the war: the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk in their early missions in North Africa, then the Bell P-39 Airacobra, then the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, before finally receiving the aircraft that would define their legacy forever. The North American P-51 Mustang, widely considered the finest American fighter aircraft of the entire war. A long-range, high-performance, exceptional handling aircraft that could escort bombers all the way to targets deep inside Germany and fight its way back out again. When the 332nd Fighter Group received their P-51 Mustangs, they did something that would make them instantly recognizable in the skies over Europe. They painted the tails of their aircraft red, bright, vivid, unmistakable red. The red tails were not just decoration, they were identity. When bomber crews looked out their windows and saw red-tailed P-51s pulling up alongside them, they knew exactly who had arrived, and they knew what that meant for their chances of getting home. Because the reputation of the red tails among bomber crews was built on one thing above all others, they stayed. When other fighter groups broke formation to chase enemy fighters for aerial kill credits, the red tails stayed with the bombers. This sounds simple. It was not. The culture of fighter aviation in World War II was deeply competitive around aerial kill counts. The number of enemy aircraft a pilot shot down was the primary measure of a fighter pilot's success and the primary path to medals, promotions, and fame. Chasing kills meant leaving your assignment. It meant leaving the bombers you were supposed to protect exposed to enemy fighters while you went hunting. And it happened constantly with other fighter groups, because the incentive structure rewarded individual kills more than mission success. The 332nd Fighter Group made a deliberate, disciplined choice to prioritize the mission over individual glory. Their job was to protect the bombers, so they protected the bombers. Every mission, with the consistency and discipline that set them apart from every other fighter group in the 15th Air Force. The result was a bomber loss rate on missions escorted by the 332nd that was among the lowest in the entire 15th Air Force. Bomber crews requested the red tails specifically. They wrote letters asking for the red-tailed escorts. They felt safer with the 332nd than with any other fighter group. Think about what that means. These were white bomber crews, men from a deeply segregated America, many from the South, men who had grown up in a society that told them black Americans were inferior, requesting the black fighter group by name because they trusted them with their lives. That trust was not given, it was earned. Mission by mission, escort by escort, the 332nd Fighter Group demonstrated through their actions what could not be argued against, that these men were the best at their job. Now let's talk about the combat record in specific detail, because the numbers tell a story that no amount of institutional prejudice could argue with. The 332nd Fighter Group flew over 1,500 combat missions during the war, over 1,500. That is an enormous operational tempo that required not just skilled pilots, but an extraordinary support and maintenance team keeping aircraft flying in combat conditions. The group destroyed over 260 enemy aircraft, both in aerial combat and on the ground, during strafing missions against German airfields and infrastructure. 260 confirmed kills is a combat record that any fighter group would be proud to claim. They flew escort missions deep into Germany, Austria, Hungary, Romania, and Poland, some of the longest and most dangerous escort missions of the entire war, requiring extraordinary navigation, fuel management, and combat awareness to complete successfully. Among their most significant missions was the escort of bombing raids on Berlin itself, the German capital, the most heavily defended target in Europe, surrounded by layers of anti-aircraft guns and Luftwaffe fighter interceptors that made every approach a gauntlet of fire. Reaching Berlin and returning was not something many aircraft did more than once. The 332nd Fighter Group did it, and they brought their bombers home. Now I want to tell you about a specific mission that perfectly captures both the extraordinary capability of these pilots and the remarkable nature of their combat record, a mission that has almost no parallel in the history of aerial warfare. On June 25, 1944, a flight of P-51 Mustangs from the 332nd Fighter Group was conducting a strafing mission against German shipping and port facilities in the Adriatic, targeting vessels that were supplying German forces and needed to be destroyed. During that mission, the pilots encountered a German destroyer, a full naval warship heavily armed with anti-aircraft guns designed to defend against exactly this kind of attack. A destroyer is not supposed to be vulnerable to fighter aircraft armed only with machine guns and cannon. It has thick steel plating, heavy anti-aircraft armament, and is designed to operate in exactly the kind of threat environment that aircraft create. The pilots of the 332nd attacked anyway, using only their aircraft's guns, no bombs, no torpedoes, no specialized anti-ship weapons. They made repeated strafing passes against the destroyer, concentrating fire on vulnerable points, maintaining attack discipline under intense anti-aircraft fire. They sank it. A group of fighter aircraft armed only with guns sank a German naval destroyer. That had essentially never been done before. It has rarely been done since. It required extraordinary skill, extraordinary courage, and extraordinary coordination under fire. That single action, sinking a destroyer with fighter aircraft guns alone, is one of the most remarkable combat achievements of any American military unit in the entire war. And most Americans have never heard of it. The 332nd Fighter Group also produced individual pilots whose combat records were exceptional by any standard. Lieutenant Colonel Lee Archer was one of the leading aces of the group, a pilot whose skill and aggressiveness in aerial combat would have earned him fame in any fighter group in any air force. Captain Joseph Ellsbury shot down 3 German aircraft in a single day, the kind of performance that in a white fighter group would have made the front pages of every newspaper in America and launched a war bond tour. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., the commanding officer of the 332nd Fighter Group, was himself a remarkable figure, the son of the first black general in American history, a West Point graduate who had been subjected to 4 years of deliberate social ostracism by his white classmates. Eating alone, sleeping alone, never being spoken to except in the line of duty. Davis had endured 4 years of that treatment at West Point and emerged from it with a discipline, a focus, and a psychological toughness that made him one of the finest combat commanders of the war. What his classmates had intended as punishment had forged something extraordinary. Davis commanded the 332nd with a combination of tactical brilliance, personal example, and absolute insistence on mission discipline that defined the group's character. When he said the bombers came first, every pilot in the group understood it was not a suggestion. Now I want to talk about what the Tuskegee Airmen faced on the ground, because their story in the air cannot be fully understood without understanding what they were dealing with every time they landed. At bases in the United States, the Tuskegee Airmen faced segregated facilities, separate barracks, separate mess halls, separate officers' clubs. Black officers were sometimes denied entry to the officers' club that their rank entitled them to use on bases where they were stationed. In April 1945, with the war in Europe nearly over, with the 332nd's combat record already established and undeniable, 101 black officers at Freeman Field in Indiana staged a coordinated protest against segregated facilities. They were arrested. 101 officers who had been flying combat missions over Germany were arrested for attempting to enter an officers' club on an American military base. The charges against most were eventually dropped, but the message from the institutional military was clear: the combat record did not change the rules. The Freeman Field Mutiny, as it became known, was a pivotal moment. It drew national attention, created political pressure, and added to the growing body of evidence that the military segregation policy was both morally indefensible and militarily counterproductive. Because here's what the institutional military had created: a situation where men who had proven themselves in combat at the highest level were being told that their service, their sacrifice, and their record counted for nothing when it came to basic dignity. That contradiction between the combat record and the institutional treatment could not hold indefinitely, and it didn't. In July 1948, 3 years after the war ended, President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9981, desegregating the United States Armed Forces. The order stated that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. The Tuskegee Airmen did not single-handedly cause that order. The desegregation of the military was the result of decades of civil rights activism, political pressure, and changing public opinion. But the combat record of the 332nd Fighter Group was one of the most powerful pieces of evidence in the argument. Because every time someone argued that Black Americans could not perform at the highest military level, the 332nd Fighter Group's record was the answer. Over 500 missions, 260 enemy aircraft destroyed, a destroyer sunk with guns alone, bomber crews requesting them by name. You cannot argue with that record. You can try to ignore it, and many in the institutional military did try, but you cannot argue with it. The evidence was too clear, the witnesses too numerous, the documentation too complete. Now let's talk about the aircraft that define the Red Tails in more detail. Because the P-51 Mustang deserves its own moment in this story, and the relationship between these pilots and their aircraft was something special. The P-51 Mustang was, by the consensus of pilots and historians, the finest American fighter aircraft of World War II. It combined exceptional speed, over 440 miles per hour at altitude, with remarkable range, good handling, and a 6-gun armament that made it deadly in the hands of a skilled pilot. The key to the Mustang's extraordinary range was the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, a British power plant that transformed a good aircraft into a great one. The combination of American airframe engineering and British engine technology produced something that neither country could have built alone. For the Tuskegee Airmen, the Mustang was more than just a good aircraft. It was validation. The Army Air Forces did not give its best aircraft to units it expected to fail. Receiving P-51 Mustangs was institutional acknowledgement, however reluctant, that the 332nd was performing at a level that deserved the best available equipment. The pilots of the 332nd learned their Mustangs the way great pilots learn their aircraft, completely, intimately, pushing the machine to understand exactly what it could and could not do. This knowledge, combined with their exceptional training, made them formidable opponents for Luftwaffe pilots who underestimated them. And the Luftwaffe did underestimate them initially. German fighter pilots, who had been told by their own propaganda that Black American pilots were inferior, were sometimes genuinely shocked by the quality of the opposition they faced when they engaged the Red Tails. That shock did not last long. The Luftwaffe was a professional military organization, and it updated its assessments quickly. By the time the 332nd was flying regular escort missions over Germany, Luftwaffe pilots knew exactly who the Red Tails meant, and they respected them. There are accounts from German pilots captured after aerial engagements with the 332nd who described their opponents with professional respect, acknowledging the quality of the flying, the discipline of the formation, and the aggressiveness of the individual pilots. Professional respect from the Luftwaffe, the finest air force Germany could put in the sky, is perhaps the most objective possible assessment of the 332nd Fighter Group's combat effectiveness. These were not easy opponents to impress. Now let's talk about what happened to these men after the war, because the story of the Tuskegee Airmen does not end when the guns stop firing, and the post-war story is both inspiring and painful in equal measure. Many of the Tuskegee Airmen who survived the war hoped that their service, their documented, undeniable, extraordinary service, would translate into recognition and opportunity in post-war America. For some it did, for many it did not. Pilots who had flown combat missions over Germany returned to an America that still had segregated lunch counters, segregated schools, and segregated opportunities. The skills they had developed, the leadership, the technical knowledge, the discipline, were not equally valued in a segregated society. Some Tuskegee Airmen went on to remarkable careers in the military, in aviation, in business, In politics, General Benjamin Davis Jr. rose to 4-star general. Daniel James Jr. became the first black 4-star general in Air Force history. These men carried the legacy of the 332nd into the highest levels of American military leadership. Others struggled. Others faced discrimination that their combat record could not overcome. Others simply came home and lived quiet lives, rarely talking about what they had done. Because in the America they returned to, what they had done was not always welcomed as the achievement it was. The full recognition of the Tuskegee Airmen's contribution came slowly, too slowly for many of the men who had earned it. Congressional gold medals were awarded in 2006, over 60 years after the war ended. Many of the men who should have received that recognition in person were no longer alive to hold it. In 2026, as the Tuskegee Airmen are being honored in Philadelphia, it is worth remembering that the recognition being given now is recognition that was earned 80 years ago, and that the delay in giving it is itself part of the story that needs to be told. Because the Tuskegee Airmen's story is not just a story about what happened in the skies over Europe between 1943 and 1945. It is a story about what America was, what America claimed to be, and the gap between those two things that these men spent their lives working to close. They fought for a country that did not fully fight for them. They defended values that their country did not fully extend to them. They compiled a combat record that proved every argument against them wrong, and then came home to a country that made them prove it again and again and again. And yet they kept proving it. That is what makes the Tuskegee Airmen story not just historically important, but genuinely inspiring. Not the sanitized, simplified inspiration of a feel-good story, but the real and complicated inspiration of men who faced genuine injustice and responded with excellence. The 332nd Fighter Group overwon 500 missions, 260 enemy aircraft destroyed, a German destroyer sunk with guns alone, bomber crews who requested them by name, a combat record that helped desegregate the American military, and a legacy that is still being fully recognized 80 years later. These were not forgotten heroes. They were ignored heroes. And there is a difference, because forgotten implies that no one knew. Ignored means that people knew and chose not to look. The Tuskegee Airmen's record was always there. America just needed to be made to see it. The Red Tails, the finest escort fighter group in the 15th Air Force. The men who proved their country wrong at 25,000 feet over Germany, and then came home and spent the rest of their lives proving it on the ground too. If you want to know about the next American weapon that changed the war in a way that nobody on the ground even knew about, an invention so secret that it was classified for years after the war ended, that story is coming next. Subscribe to Eddie Arsenal, hit that notification bell, and I will see you in the next one. Let's load it up.